I knew buying 100 acres of lakefront property in northern Minnesota would come with challenges, but I never imagined the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association would become my worst nightmare. My name is Xavier Crawford, and I am a 42-year-old pilot who made my fortune flying cargo across Alaska before retiring to pursue my real passion, seaplanes. When I found this sprawling property on Lake Vermilion back in 2023, it seemed like destiny. The land stretched along 2 miles of pristine shoreline, with a natural cove perfect for docking seaplanes. The previous owner, an eccentric old logger named Harold, had used the property as a timber operation decades ago. What made it even more valuable was the private road cutting through my land, the only practical route connecting the Whispering Pines subdivision to the main highway and the town of Tower, Minnesota. Harold had granted the HOA an informal easement to use his road back in 1987 when the subdivision was first developed. The deal was never properly recorded with the county, just a handshake agreement between old friends. When Harold passed away and his estate sold me the property, that informal arrangement came with it, though it was not legally binding. I honored it anyway because I am not the kind of person who goes looking for trouble. I spent my first year on the property building my dream home, a cedar lodge overlooking the water with a boathouse big enough for 3 seaplanes. I had my pride and joy, a restored 1956 de Havilland Beaver, along with a newer Cessna 206 on floats and a small ultralight seaplane I had built myself. The setup was legal, properly registered with the FAA, and posed no danger to anyone. I even had the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources approve my dock configuration and water usage. Everything was perfect until Patricia Hendricks moved into the subdivision. Patricia was 53 years old, recently divorced, and had apparently decided that her new purpose in life was to make everyone around her miserable. Within 3 months of moving to Whispering Pines, she had gotten herself elected HOA president by showing up to every meeting and wearing down the other residents with her relentless complaints about property values, community standards, and her vision for what she called a prestigious lakeside community. The first time I met Patricia was on a brilliant August morning. I was performing my pre-flight check on the Beaver, planning a trip up to International Falls to visit an old friend. The sound of an engine caught my attention, and I looked up to see a white Mercedes SUV bouncing down my private road, kicking up dust. The vehicle came to an abrupt stop near my boathouse, and out stepped Patricia, dressed like she was about to attend a country club luncheon rather than trek through the Minnesota woods. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Are you Xavier Crawford?" "That would be me," I replied, continuing my inspection of the plane's floats. "I am Patricia Hendricks, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your little airplane hobby." I straightened up and looked at her properly. She had the kind of haircut that screamed expensive salon visits, perfectly manicured nails, and an expression that suggested she had been sucking on lemons. "It is not a hobby. It is my livelihood and my property. What exactly do you want to discuss?" "The noise is absolutely unacceptable," she said, crossing her arms. "Do you have any idea how disruptive it is to have seaplanes taking off and landing at all hours? My neighbors are complaining. This is a residential area, not an airport." "This is not a residential area," I corrected her. "This is my private property, which happens to be adjacent to your residential area. I have every legal right to operate seaplanes from my own dock. The FAA has approved it, the DNR has approved it, and the county has no objections." Patricia's face flushed red. "We will see about that." "The HOA has standards to maintain. Property values in Whispering Pines have increased by 17% since I took over as president, and I will not let some bush pilot ruin that. Good luck with your crusade, I said, turning back to my plane. Now, if you do not mind, you are trespassing on my property, and I have a flight to catch. She stood there sputtering for a moment before storming back to her Mercedes and speeding off. I should have known that would not be the end of it. Over the next 2 months, Patricia launched a campaign that would have impressed a military strategist. She started filing noise complaints with the county, even though my operations were well within legal limits. She contacted the FAA with bogus safety concerns, triggering an inspection that found absolutely nothing wrong. She even tried to get the DNR to revoke my water use permit by claiming I was disturbing fish habitats, which was laughable considering the lake had been used for seaplane operations since the 1930s. Every complaint was investigated and dismissed. Every attempt to find some violation came up empty. I was operating completely within the law, and there was nothing she could do about it. Then Patricia got creative. In October, I received a certified letter from the Whispering Pines HOA. Inside was a notice informing me that the HOA had passed a new community ordinance prohibiting the operation of commercial seaplane bases within a 2-mile radius of the subdivision. The letter claimed that my property, while not technically part of the HOA, fell under their jurisdiction due to something they called community impact zones. I read the letter 3 times, each time becoming more amazed at the audacity. They were trying to create their own laws that would apply to property they did not own or control. It was completely insane and entirely unenforceable. I called my attorney, a sharp woman named Margaret Olson who had handled my property purchase. She laughed when I read her the letter. "They cannot do that," Margaret said. "An HOA only has jurisdiction over properties that are actually part of the HOA and subject to its covenants. Your property is not part of Whispering Pines. This ordinance is worth less than the paper it is printed on. So I can just ignore it." Absolutely. In fact, I would recommend you send them a response letter making it clear that you do not recognize their authority over your property and that you will continue your legal operations. We should establish a paper trail in case this escalates. I followed her advice and sent a polite but firm response. I thought that would be the end of it. Patricia would realize she had overstepped, and we would all move on with our lives. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I returned from a supply run to Duluth to find a sheriff's deputy waiting at my dock. Deputy Mike Johnson was a reasonable guy I had met a few times at the local diner. He looked uncomfortable as I tied up the beaver. "Xavier, I am sorry about this," he said, holding up a piece of paper. "I have been instructed to serve you with a cease and desist order regarding your seaplane operations." "From who?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "The Whispering Pines HOA. They filed a complaint with the county claiming you are operating an illegal commercial airport without proper zoning approval." I took the paper and scanned it quickly. "Mike, you know this is garbage, right? I am not operating a commercial airport. These are my personal aircraft, and I occasionally do some freelance cargo work, which is perfectly legal under my existing permits." "I know, Xavier. I am just delivering the paper. You will have to respond through the county zoning board. There is a hearing scheduled for November 15th. After Mike left, I immediately called Margaret. She was less amused this time. "They are trying to bury you in bureaucracy," she explained. "Even though they will lose, they can drag you through hearings and appeals, costing you time and money. It is a harassment tactic. What do I do?" "We show up to the hearing, present your documentation, and make them look foolish." I will prepare a brief outlining exactly why you are in full compliance with all applicable laws. This is going to backfire on them spectacularly. The hearing took place in the Lake County Government Center in Two Harbors. I drove down with Margaret, bringing a thick folder of permits, FAA documentation, and correspondence with various government agencies. The hearing room was small, with a panel of 3 county commissioners sitting at a long table. Patricia was there with 2 other HOA board members and a lawyer who looked fresh out of law school. The commissioners listened as Patricia's lawyer made their case, which boiled down to claiming that my seaplane operations constituted a commercial airport requiring special zoning that my property did not have. He cited noise concerns, safety issues, and the impact on the residential character of the area. When it was our turn, Margaret calmly dismantled every argument. She presented documentation showing that I was not operating a commercial airport, but rather using my property for personal aviation, which was explicitly allowed under county zoning regulations. She showed that my occasional freelance work did not meet the threshold for commercial operations requiring special permits. She presented letters from the FAA, DNR, and even the Minnesota Seaplane Pilots Association supporting my operations. The commissioners asked a few questions, thanked everyone for their time, and said they would issue a decision within 10 business days. 8 days later, I received the ruling. The county found entirely in my favor, stating unequivocally that my seaplane operations were legal and that the HOA had no standing to challenge them. The decision included language that essentially told Patricia to stop wasting everyone's time. I thought I had won. I thought Patricia would finally accept defeat and leave me alone. Instead, she declared war. The week after the hearing decision, I woke up to find survey stakes driven into the ground along my private road. Attached to each stake was a small sign reading Property of Whispering Pines, HOA Private Road No Trespassing. I stood there in my bathrobe, coffee in hand, staring at the stakes in disbelief. Patricia was now claiming that my road, which ran through my property, was actually owned by the HOA. It was the boldest, most ridiculous move yet. I called Margaret immediately. "She is trying to claim adverse possession," Margaret said after I explained the situation. "If the HOA has been using the road continuously for a certain period, they might try to argue they have acquired rights to it. But they have only been using it because Harold and I let them. It was never their property." Exactly. And in Minnesota, adverse possession requires use that is hostile, meaning without permission. Since both you and Harold explicitly gave permission, they have no claim. Pull those stakes out and send them another letter. I spent the morning removing every single stake and piling them at the entrance to my property, along with a sign that read, "Nice try." Margaret sent a strongly worded letter to the HOA explaining basic property law. Patricia responded by having the HOA hire a surveying company to come out and measure the road, trying to find any evidence that it might cross property lines in a way that would give them a claim. The surveyors, to their credit, did their job professionally and confirmed what I already knew. The entire road was on my property. The HOA had no ownership claim whatsoever. That is when I started seriously thinking about the nuclear option. The road that crossed my property was not just convenient for the Whispering Pines residents. It was essential. Without it, they would have to take a route that added 45 minutes to their drive into Tower, winding around the lake on poorly maintained Forest Service roads. During winter, that alternate route was often impassable. The subdivision had been built with the assumption that Harold's road would always be available, but it was my road now, and I had never granted the HOA a formal easement. I sat down with Margaret to discuss the legal implications. "Can I legally revoke their access to my road?" I asked. Margaret leaned back in her chair, considering carefully. "Legally speaking, yes. The informal arrangement with Harold was never recorded as an easement. You own the property and you have the right to control who uses it. However, there are a few things to consider. First, they might try to claim a prescriptive easement similar to adverse possession based on their long-term use. Second, this will create enormous hardship for the residents, not just Patricia. And third, it is going to get very ugly very fast. What would I need to do to protect myself legally? Document everything. Make sure you have clear records showing that their use was always permissive, not hostile. Keep copies of all correspondence. If you decide to revoke access, do it in writing with proper notice. And be prepared for them to sue you." I spent several days thinking about it. I am not a vindictive person by nature. Most of the residents in Whispering Pines were probably decent people who had nothing to do with Patricia's crusade. But Patricia had made it clear she would not stop until she had driven me out or destroyed my ability to use my property as I saw fit. Every time I won legally, she escalated. She had cost me thousands of dollars in legal fees, countless hours of stress, and had tried to paint me as a menace to the community. The final straw came in early December. I was in my hangar performing maintenance on the Cessna when I heard vehicles approaching. I walked outside to find Patricia, her lawyer, and two men in suits standing near my boathouse. One of the men was taking photographs while the other was making notes on a clipboard. "What is going on here?" I demanded. Patricia turned to me with a triumphant smile. "The HOA has filed for a restraining order against you. These gentlemen are from the county, documenting the unsafe conditions of your so-called Seaplane base. You need to leave my property right now," I said, my voice level but firm. "This is a matter of public safety," Patricia said. "We have the right to document hazardous conditions that affect our community." "No, you do not. This is private property and you are trespassing. Leave now or I am calling the sheriff." The photographer, looking uncomfortable, said, "Madam, if he is asking us to leave, we should probably go." Patricia glared at him but eventually nodded. As they walked back to their vehicles, she called out, "You are going to lose everything, Xavier. This is just the beginning." I called Margaret as soon as they left. They filed for a restraining order. "I have not seen anything yet, but I will check with the court. If they did file, it is completely frivolous. You cannot get a restraining order against someone for legally using their own property. Any judge will throw it out immediately." She was right. The restraining order request was denied within 24 hours, but the incident crystallized something for me. Patricia would never stop. No matter how many times the law sided with me, she would find new ways to attack. She had the HOA budget to fund her vendetta, and she clearly had nothing better to do with her time. I made my decision that night. The next morning, I drafted a letter to the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I kept the language simple and direct. To the Whispering Pines HOA Board of Directors, this letter serves as formal notice that effective January 1st, 2024, permission to use the private road crossing my property at 4750 Lakeshore Drive is hereby revoked. This road is entirely on my private property and has been made available to your residents as a courtesy. Due to ongoing harassment, frivolous legal actions, and trespassing by HOA representatives, I am no longer willing to extend this courtesy. As of January 1st, the road will be gated and locked. Any attempt to access the road without my explicit written permission will be considered trespassing and will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. This decision is final and non-negotiable. Sincerely, Xavier Crawford. Margaret reviewed the letter and suggested a few minor changes to strengthen the legal language. Then I sent it via certified mail to ensure they could not claim they never received it. I also sent copies to each individual homeowner in the subdivision. I wanted them to know exactly who was responsible for this situation. The response was immediate and explosive. My phone started ringing within hours of the letters being delivered. The first call was from a man named Robert Chen who lived on Maple Court in the subdivision. "Mr. Crawford, please tell me this is some kind of joke. That road is the only practical way in and out of the neighborhood." "I am sorry, Mr. Chen, but this is not a joke. Your HOA president has spent the last 6 months trying to destroy my livelihood. I have tried to be reasonable, but she will not stop. But this affects all of us, not just Patricia. There are families here, elderly people. The alternate route is dangerous, especially in winter. I understand that, and I am truly sorry. But I have the legal right to control access to my property. If you are upset about this situation, I suggest you take it up with your HOA board." I had similar conversations with a dozen other residents that day. Most were angry, some were pleading, a few were understanding. I felt terrible about the situation, but I also knew that sometimes you have to take drastic action to get people's attention. Patricia's response came via her lawyer. They sent a letter threatening to sue for denial of access, claiming the residents had established a prescriptive easement through decades of use. Margaret responded with a detailed brief explaining why no such easement existed, supported by documentation of Harold's explicit permission, and my continuation of that permission up until now. The key legal point was that the use had always been permissive, not adverse, which meant no prescriptive easement could have formed. The HOA did sue, just as Margaret predicted. They filed an emergency motion asking the court to prevent me from gating the road until the easement question could be resolved. The hearing was scheduled for December 20th. I spent the days leading up to the hearing installing a heavy-duty gate across the road, just past where it entered my property from the highway. The gate was serious, commercial-grade steel with a lock that would require serious equipment to breach. I also installed security cameras covering the gate and the road, storing footage on a cloud server. If anyone tried to force their way through, I would have evidence. The hearing was held before Judge Thomas Reynolds, a 70-year-old jurist known for his no-nonsense approach and deep knowledge of property law. The courtroom was packed with residents from Whispering Pines, most looking angry or anxious. Patricia sat at the plaintiff's table with her legal team, looking confident. The HOA's argument was that the road had been used continuously for nearly 40 years, and that the residents had a right to continued access based on established use. Their lawyer argued that blocking the road created a severe hardship and constituted retaliatory behavior for the residents exercising their legal rights. Margaret's response was surgical. She presented documentation showing that Harold had explicitly given permission for the road use, including letters he had written to the county and the subdivision developer. She showed that I had continued that permission voluntarily until the ongoing harassment made it untenable. She argued that there was no legal basis for forcing a property owner to provide access across their land when no easement existed, and the use had always been permissive. Judge Reynolds asked pointed questions of both sides. To the HOA lawyer, he asked, "Do you have any documentation showing that your client's use of this road was ever hostile or adverse to the property owner's interests?" The lawyer admitted they did not. "You have any evidence that an easement was ever recorded with the county?" Again, no. Then on what legal basis are you asking me to force Mr. Crawford to provide access across his private property? The lawyer tried to argue hardship and established use, but Judge Reynolds cut him off. Hardship is not a basis for creating an easement where none exists. If the subdivision was developed with the assumption of access across someone else's property without securing a proper easement, that is a failure of planning, not Mr. Crawford's problem. The judge ruled from the bench, denying the HOA's motion. He stated clearly that I had the legal right to control access to my property, and that the HOA had failed to demonstrate any legal right to use the road. He suggested that the parties attempt to negotiate an agreement, but made it clear he would not compel me to provide access. As we left the courtroom, several residents approached me. A woman in her 60s, Mary Sullivan, grabbed my arm. "Please, Mr. Crawford, I have a heart condition. If I have a medical emergency and the ambulance has to take the long route, it could be the difference between life and death." Her desperation was genuine, and it tugged at my conscience. "Mrs. Sullivan, I am not trying to hurt anyone, but your HOA president has made my life hell for months. If your community wants access to this road, you need to remove her from power and come to me ready to negotiate in good faith." "She will never resign," another resident said. "Patricia does not back down from anything." "Then vote her out, call a special election, do whatever you need to do. But understand this, I will not be bullied or harassed. I have tried being nice and it got me nothing but legal bills and stress." Over the next week, something interesting happened. The residents of Whispering Pines, faced with the reality of losing their convenient access to town, began to turn on Patricia. I heard through the grapevine that angry homeowners were confronting her at every opportunity. A petition began circulating demanding her resignation. Patricia, predictably, refused to step down. She sent an email to all residents claiming I was a bully and a tyrant, and that giving in to my demands would set a dangerous precedent. She urged residents to stay strong and promised that her legal team would find a way to restore access. On January 1st, as promised, I locked the gate. The immediate impact was dramatic. Residents trying to leave for work that morning found themselves blocked, forced to take the long route around the lake. What had been a 15-minute drive to town became over an hour. People were late for work, late for appointments, and absolutely furious. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered at the gate. I watched on my security cameras as people argued, some directing their anger at Patricia, others talking about me. A few tried to reason with the lock, as if willing it to open. Patricia herself showed up around noon, trying to give some kind of speech about staying united against my tyranny, but the crowd was not receptive. "This is your fault, Patricia," someone shouted. "You just could not leave him alone. We should sue you," another voice called out. "You have destroyed our property values and our quality of life." I almost felt bad for her. Almost. That evening, I received a call from a man named Douglas Whitmore who identified himself as a member of the HOA board. "Mr. Crawford, I want you to know that several of us on the board had no idea Patricia was taking things this far. We thought she was just filing some noise complaints, standard HOA stuff. We did not know about the trespassing or the bogus legal actions." "I appreciate that, Mr. Whitmore, but it does not change the situation. I understand. A group of us are working to call a special election to remove Patricia from the board. We should have votes by the end of the week. Once she is gone, would you be willing to negotiate an arrangement for the road?" "Possibly. But I want a formal, recorded easement. I want compensation for the use of my property. And I want a written agreement that the HOA will take no further action regarding my seaplane operations." "That seems reasonable. Let me work on getting Patricia out, and then we can talk seriously. The special election was held on January 8th. Patricia fought it every step of the way, but the votes were overwhelming. She was removed as president by a margin of 43-7. Douglas Whitmore was elected as interim president, but Patricia was not done yet. On January 10th, I was working in my hangar when I heard the sound of breaking glass. I ran outside to find Patricia standing next to the Cessna, holding a baseball bat. She had smashed one of the windows on the plane and was winding up to take another swing. "You destroyed everything," she screamed. "Do you know how much time I put into making that neighborhood perfect? Do you know how hard I worked?" I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Patricia, put down the bat and leave my property right now." She turned toward me, her face twisted with rage. "I am not leaving until you pay for what you have done to me. They humiliated me because of you. They treated me like I was the problem when I was just trying to protect property values. You vandalized my aircraft. That is a federal crime. Put down the bat and leave before this gets worse." She looked at the bat in her hands, then at the damaged plane, and something seemed to break in her. She dropped the bat and collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "It was not supposed to go like this. I was just trying to help." I called the sheriff while keeping my phone trained on her. Deputy Mike Johnson arrived within 20 minutes, along with a second deputy. They found Patricia sitting on the ground near my boathouse, still crying. "Xavier, what happened?" Mike asked. I showed him the video on my phone and the damaged aircraft. "She showed up and attacked my plane with a bat. It is all recorded. I want to press charges." Mike looked at Patricia with something like pity. "Madam, I need you to stand up. You are under arrest for criminal damage to property." The arrest seemed to snap Patricia back to reality. As the deputies led her to the patrol car, she started yelling again. "He provoked me. He took away the road just to hurt me. This is all his fault." "Madam, you need to calm down," Mike said firmly. "You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it." After they left, I inspected the damage to the Cessna. The broken window was expensive but repairable. The bigger issue was that Patricia had also damaged one of the floats, probably when she first arrived and I had not heard it. The repair would cost several $1,000s. I called Margaret to let her know what happened. "That was incredibly stupid of her," Margaret said. Destroying an aircraft, even just damaging it, is a federal offense under 18 U.S. Code Section 32. She is looking at serious charges. "I just want her to leave me alone," I said, suddenly feeling exhausted. "After this, she will not have a choice. She will be dealing with criminal charges, potential federal charges, and almost certainly civil liability for the damages. Her vendetta is over." The next day, Douglas Whitmore called to apologize profusely for Patricia's actions and to assure me that the HOA would do everything possible to make things right. We scheduled a meeting for the following week to discuss the road situation. That meeting took place in Douglas's living room, a comfortable space with a view of the lake. Present were Douglas, two other board members named Sarah Winters and Thomas Klein, and Margaret representing my interests. "Mr. Crawford," Douglas began, "I want to start by saying that what Patricia did was inexcusable. She acted without the board's knowledge or consent on virtually everything she did regarding your property. We are deeply sorry for the harassment you endured." "I appreciate that," I said. "But what I really need is assurance that this will not happen again." "Absolutely. Here is what we are proposing. We want to establish a formal easement for the road, properly recorded with the county. In exchange, we are prepared to pay you a one-time fee of $75,000 for the easement rights, plus $5,000 annually for maintenance and upkeep. We will also put in writing that the HOA recognizes your right to operate your seaplane base without interference and will take no action to limit or restrict your legal use of your property. Margaret and I had discussed terms beforehand. The offer was generous, more than I had expected. I want the agreement to include a clause that if any HOA representative trespasses on my property or files any frivolous legal action regarding my seaplanes, the easement can be revoked with 30 days' notice. Douglas nodded. That is fair. We will also include a clause requiring any HOA action affecting your property to be approved by a 2/3 vote of the full board, not just the president. No more unilateral decisions. We spent the next 2 hours working through the details. Margaret drafted language for the easement agreement, and we all reviewed it carefully. By the end of the meeting, we had a framework that everyone could accept. The formal easement was recorded with Lake County on January 25, 2024. The HOA paid me the $75,000, which more than covered my legal expenses and the repairs to the Cessna. I opened the gate, and life slowly returned to normal. Patricia's legal troubles were just beginning. She was charged with criminal damage to property and trespassing. The FAA also got involved because of the damage to the aircraft, though they ultimately decided not to pursue federal charges since the damage was relatively minor, and Patricia had no prior record. She pleaded guilty to the state charges and received 2 years probation, a substantial fine, and was ordered to pay restitution for the damages to my plane. More devastating for Patricia was the civil lawsuit. I sued her personally for damages, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. My attorney documented every frivolous legal action, every instance of trespassing, and the months of harassment. The case settled out of court for an undisclosed sum that was large enough to make a significant dent in Patricia's finances. She moved out of Whispering Pines in March, and I heard through the grapevine that she relocated to Arizona to live with her sister. I never saw her again. Life at Lake Vermilion became what I had always hoped it would be. The residents of Whispering Pines, grateful for the restored access and embarrassed by Patricia's behavior, went out of their way to be good neighbors. Several of them even became friends, stopping by occasionally to see the planes or have coffee. Douglas Whitmore proved to be an excellent HOA president, focusing on actual community issues like road maintenance and snow removal, rather than crusades against neighbors. Under his leadership, the HOA established clear guidelines limiting what actions could be taken regarding properties outside the subdivision. My seaplane operation continued without incident. I took on a few more freelance cargo jobs, enjoyed countless flights across Minnesota's beautiful lake country, and finally got to live the peaceful life I had envisioned when I bought the property. One afternoon in early summer, I was sitting on my dock watching the sunset when I saw a small boat approaching. It was Mary Sullivan, the elderly woman with the heart condition who had confronted me outside the courthouse. She pulled up to my dock, and I helped her tie off. "I hope I am not intruding," she said. "I wanted to bring you something." She handed me a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Inside were fresh baked cookies and a card signed by dozens of residents from Whispering Pines, thanking me for being reasonable and working out the road agreement. "This is very kind," I said, genuinely touched. "We are sorry for everything you went through," Mary said. "Most of us had no idea what Patricia was doing. We thought she was just being a typical HOA president, a little annoying but mostly harmless. We did not realize she was waging a personal war against you. I appreciate that, and I am sorry I had to close the road. I know it caused hardship for a lot of people who did not deserve it." "You did what you had to do," Mary said firmly. Patricia left you no choice. Sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to show them you are not afraid to fight back. We talked for a while longer, and I learned that Mary's husband had been a pilot in the Korean War. She loved watching my planes take off and land, she said. It reminded her of him. Before she left, she invited me to a community barbecue the HOA was hosting the following weekend. I went to that barbecue and had a surprisingly good time. People were friendly and welcoming, treating me like a regular neighbor rather than the guy who had held their road hostage. I realized that most of them were just normal people trying to live their lives, caught up in Patricia's drama through no fault of their own. Over the following months, I became more integrated into the community. I gave flying lessons to a teenager from the subdivision who dreamed of becoming a commercial pilot. I helped with the annual fundraiser for the local fire department by offering Seaplane rides as a raffle prize. Life took on a comfortable rhythm. The legal resolution with the HOA turned out to be mutually beneficial. The formal easement gave them security, knowing they would always have access to the road as long as they upheld their end of the agreement. For me, the annual maintenance fee provided income, while the written protections for my seaplane operations gave me peace of mind. I often thought about what the whole experience had taught me. It would have been easy to dismiss Patricia as just a crazy HOA president, but I think the situation was more complex than that. She had clearly invested her identity in being the person who improved Whispering Pines, and when she perceived my seaplanes as a threat to that vision, she could not let it go. Her inability to accept that she could not control everything around her led to her downfall. For my part, I learned that sometimes standing your ground requires taking actions that seem harsh or extreme. I had tried being reasonable, tried following every legal channel, and tried explaining my position calmly. None of it worked until I took away something they valued. It was not about revenge. It was about establishing that I would not be pushed around on my own property. The nuclear option of closing the road had been necessary to break the stalemate and force real negotiations. If I had not done it, Patricia would have continued her campaign indefinitely, filing complaint after complaint, launching legal action after legal action, always believing that eventually she would find something that stuck. By September, the whole ordeal felt like ancient history. I was sitting in my favorite chair on the deck one evening, watching the beaver bob gently at the dock when my phone rang. It was Margaret. Xavier, I thought you would want to know. Patricia Hendricks tried to sue the HOA. For what? She claims they wrongfully terminated her as president and that the special election was invalid. She is seeking reinstatement and damages. I laughed, though there was no real humor in it. She really cannot let this go, can she? Apparently not, but her case has no merit. The HOA followed their bylaws precisely when removing her. The suit will be dismissed. I think she is just lashing out, trying to hurt anyone she can blame for her situation. Keep me posted if anything develops, but honestly, I am done thinking about Patricia Hendricks. The lawsuit was indeed dismissed 3 months later. I heard nothing more about Patricia after that. As winter approached and the lake began to ice over, I transitioned from seaplanes to ski planes, swapping out the floats for skis on the Cessna. The Beaver went into storage for the season. Winter flying in Minnesota is magical. Soaring over a landscape transformed into white and blue, landing on frozen lakes that become temporary runways. One particularly clear January morning, almost exactly a year after I had locked the gate, I was preparing for a flight when Douglas Whitmore came down the road on a snowmobile. He had called ahead, so I knew he was coming. Xavier, good morning. Do you have a minute? Sure, what is up? The HOA board wanted me to check in with you. It has been a year since we established the easement, and everything has been going smoothly. We wanted to make sure you are satisfied with the arrangement and see if there is anything we could do better. It was a thoughtful gesture, the kind of proactive communication that Patricia had never bothered with. Honestly, Douglas, everything has been great. The annual payment arrived on time, there have been no issues with the road, and I have not heard a single complaint about my planes. Good. That is what we hope to hear. You know, having you as a neighbor has been surprisingly beneficial for the community. That young man you have been teaching to fly, Marcus Chen, is applying to the Air Force Academy. His parents say you were a huge influence on him. Marcus is a good kid with real talent. I just gave him some guidance. Well, we appreciate it. Also, a few residents have asked if you would be willing to do a presentation at our spring community meeting about aviation and lake operations. Nothing formal, just sharing your knowledge and experiences. People find it interesting. I would be happy to do that. We talked for a few more minutes before Douglas headed back. As I watched him disappear up the road, I reflected on how dramatically things had changed. What had started as a nightmare scenario had ultimately led to a better situation than I could have hoped for. I had legal protection for my seaplane operations, a formal easement agreement that provided income, and good relationships with my neighbors. The key had been standing firm on principle while remaining open to reasonable solutions. I had not backed down when Patricia tried to bully me, but I also had not tried to punish innocent people once the real problem was removed. The residents of Whispering Pines had proven willing to negotiate in good faith once Patricia was out of the picture, and we had found a solution that worked for everyone. That spring, I did the presentation at the HOA community meeting. About 40 residents attended, and I spent an hour talking about seaplane operations, safety procedures, and the history of aviation on Minnesota lakes. People asked thoughtful questions, and several expressed appreciation for having something unique in their community. One person even joked that having a seaplane base nearby was a positive for property values, not a negative, because it made the area distinctive. After the presentation, a real estate agent from the subdivision approached me. "Mr. Crawford, I want you to know that I have been selling homes in Whispering Pines for 15 years. During Patricia's time as president, sales slowed down because of all the drama and conflict she created. Since you worked out the easement agreement and things calmed down, the market has been stronger than ever. People like buying into a community that can solve problems cooperatively." It was gratifying to hear, though I reminded her that I had not wanted any conflict in the first place. As months turned into years, the whole episode became just another story in the history of Lake Vermilion. New residents moved into Whispering Pines who had never heard of Patricia Hendricks and had no idea there had ever been any dispute over the road. To them, I was just the guy with the cool seaplanes who lived on the big property down the shore. I continued flying, taking on the occasional cargo job, giving lessons to aspiring pilots, and enjoying the freedom that had drawn me to this life in the first place. The Beaver, now 70 years old, still flew beautifully, a testament to classic engineering and proper maintenance. The Cessna proved itself reliable through countless takeoffs and landings on lakes, rivers, and the occasional challenging backcountry strip. Marcus Chen did get into the Air Force Academy and sent me a thank you letter crediting our flying lessons with helping him discover his passion for aviation. I framed that letter and hung it in my hangar. Years later, when he graduated and earned his wings as a military pilot, he flew home on leave and we took the Beaver up together, 2 pilots sharing the sky. The annual easement payments continued without issue. Douglas served 3 terms as HOA president before passing the role to someone else, but the culture he had established continued. The HOA focused on maintaining common areas, organizing community events, and handling the mundane administrative tasks that such organizations exist for. They stayed out of property disputes and individual homeowner decisions. It was boring and functional, exactly what an HOA should be. I saw Patricia one more time, years later. I was in Phoenix on a cargo run, delivering specialized equipment to a mining operation north of the city. While grabbing lunch at a small cafe, I spotted her sitting alone at a corner table. She looked older, tired, and was staring at her phone with an expression of deep concentration. For a moment, I considered approaching her, maybe trying to find some closure or understanding. But then I realized there was nothing to say. Whatever demons had driven Patricia to wage war against me were her own to deal with. I had moved on, built a good life, and found peace. Whether she had done the same was not my concern. I finished my lunch and left without speaking to her. Some chapters close themselves. Back at Lake Vermilion, life continued in its pleasant rhythm. I added a 3rd hangar bay and acquired a vintage Piper Cub on floats, a small plane perfect for solo flights on calm summer evenings. The sunsets over the lake never got old, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple while loons called across the water. The property I had fought so hard to protect and use freely had become everything I hoped it would be. My seaplanes operated without restriction. I had positive relationships with my neighbors, and the legal protections in place ensured that no future HOA president could try what Patricia had attempted. Looking back, I sometimes wondered what would have happened if I had just accepted Patricia's initial demands, maybe limited my flying, or agreed to unnecessary restrictions just to keep the peace. I would have saved myself months of stress and thousands in legal fees. But I also would have set a precedent that my rights could be trampled if someone complained loudly enough. I would have been looking over my shoulder forever, wondering when the next demand would come. Standing up to the HOA's overreach had been the right choice, even though it required taking drastic action. The road closure, while painful for innocent residents in the short term, had been the only way to force serious negotiations. It demonstrated that I had leverage and was willing to use it, which fundamentally changed the power dynamic. The situation had also exposed Patricia's true nature to her own community. Without my resistance, she might have continued as HOA president for years, making life miserable for other residents with her next crusade. By forcing a confrontation that she could not win, I had inadvertently freed the community from a toxic leader. Years passed, and the story of the HOA dispute became something I told occasionally when other pilots asked how I had secured such a perfect seaplane base. It always got reactions, a mixture of disbelief at Patricia's audacity and respect for how I had handled it. Several people told me they wished they had stood up to their own HOAs instead of just accepting unreasonable restrictions. I encouraged them to know their rights. Too many property owners assume that HOAs have unlimited power, when in reality, their authority is quite limited, constrained by law and their own governing documents. Understanding property law, maintaining good documentation, and being willing to enforce your rights are crucial to dealing with overreaching HOAs. One crisp October afternoon, nearly 5 years after the whole ordeal had concluded, I was giving a flying lesson to a young woman named Jennifer, who worked as an emergency room nurse in Duluth. We were practicing water landings, and after a particularly smooth touchdown, she turned to me with a huge smile. "That was incredible," she said. I cannot believe I am actually flying a seaplane. You are a natural, I told her. Another few lessons and you will be ready to solo. As we taxied back toward my dock, Jennifer said, "Can I ask you something? I heard from someone in town that you had some kind of big fight with the HOA a few years ago. What was that about?" I gave her the condensed version as we secured the plane and walked back to the hangar. When I finished, she shook her head in amazement. "You closed the road. That is incredibly bold. It was the only leverage I had. Sometimes you have to be willing to take dramatic action to protect your rights. I am dealing with something similar, actually. Not an HOA, but the hospital administration wants to change our scheduling in ways that violate our union contract. We have been trying to fight it through normal channels, but they are not taking us seriously. Then you need to demonstrate that you are serious. Find out what leverage you have and be willing to use it. Obviously, do not do anything illegal or unethical, but make it clear you will not back down." She nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. We have been too focused on being reasonable and accommodating. Maybe we need to show some teeth." 6 months later, Jennifer told me that her unit had staged a coordinated sick-out that forced the hospital to negotiate seriously. They got a contract that preserved their scheduling rights and included better pay. She credited our conversation with giving her the courage to push back. It was gratifying to think that my experience might help others stand up for themselves. The whole ordeal with Patricia and the HOA, as stressful and frustrating as it had been at the time, had taught me valuable lessons about power, negotiation, and the importance of defending your rights even when it is uncomfortable or difficult. As I approached my 50th birthday, I found myself reflecting on the decade I had spent at Lake Vermilion. The property had appreciated significantly in value, not just because of the real estate market, but because I had maintained it well and added improvements like the additional hangar and upgraded dock facilities. The seaplane operation had grown modestly, with a steady stream of freelance work and flying lessons providing income that supplemented my retirement savings. More importantly, I had built a life that aligned with my values and interests. Every morning, I woke up to a view of the lake and my plains. I spent my days doing work I loved, teaching skills I was passionate about, and living in one of the most beautiful places on earth. The fight with the HOA, in retrospect, had been a necessary crucible that forged the security and freedom I now enjoyed. The formal easement agreement continued to function perfectly, generating annual income while ensuring the residents of Whispering Pines could access their homes conveniently. The legal protections for my seaplane operations meant I never had to worry about some future busybody trying to shut me down. Everything was documented, recorded, and legally binding. On the 10th anniversary of buying the property, I threw a party. I invited residents from Whispering Pines, friends from town, fellow pilots from across the region, and students I had taught over the years. We set up tables on my lawn overlooking the lake, grilled burgers and fish, and watched the sunset together. Douglas Whitmore, now retired from the HOA board but still living in the subdivision, raised his glass during the informal toasts. To Xavier, a neighbor who taught us all the importance of respecting property rights and working together to find solutions. This community is better because you stood your ground when it mattered. People clapped and cheered. I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the beer I was drinking. This was community in its truest sense, people who had worked through conflict and come out stronger on the other side. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself standing alone at the dock, watching the beaver rock gently in the evening breeze. The plane had been the catalyst for everything, the reason Patricia had targeted me in the first place. But it was also the reason I had fought so hard. Flying was not just a hobby or a job, it was part of who I was. Giving it up or accepting restrictions on it would have been giving up a piece of myself. That was the real lesson from the whole experience. When someone tries to take away something fundamental to who you are, you fight for it. You do not accept the injustice just to avoid conflict. You stand firm, use every legal tool at your disposal, and refuse to be bullied into submission. Patricia had been a bully, using the HOA as her weapon. She had expected me to fold when faced with her complaints and legal threats. When I did not, when I fought back at every turn, she had escalated until her own behavior destroyed her. The vandalism of my plane had been an act of desperation by someone who could not accept that they had lost. I did not take pleasure in Patricia's downfall. In fact, I felt a certain sadness about how things had ended for her. If she had just left me alone from the beginning, if she had focused on legitimate HOA business instead of trying to control properties outside her jurisdiction, none of it would have happened. She would still be HOA president, probably still annoying her neighbors with petty rules, but at least not facing criminal charges and financial ruin. But people like Patricia rarely have that kind of self-awareness or restraint. They see something they do not like, and they assume it is their right and responsibility to eliminate it. They mistake their personal preferences for objective standards and their desire for control for legitimate authority. The HOA structure had enabled Patricia's worst impulses by giving her a platform and a veneer of official authority. That is the danger of HOAs in general. While they can serve useful purposes like maintaining common areas and establishing basic community standards, they also attract people who crave power over their neighbors. In the wrong hands, an HOA becomes a tool of harassment and petty tyranny. The best defense against HOA overreach is knowledge and willingness to assert your rights. Know what authority the HOA actually has. Understand property law in your state. Document everything, and be prepared to fight when necessary through legal channels and strategic leverage. My story had a happy ending because I did all those things. I knew my rights, I documented every incident, I hired a competent attorney, and I was willing to use my leverage when negotiations failed. The road closure was not my first choice, but it was effective because it demonstrated resolve and imposed real costs on the people who had enabled Patricia's behavior. Would I do anything differently if I could go back? Maybe I would have installed the security cameras earlier, so I had video evidence of some of Patricia's trespassing incidents. Maybe I would have been more proactive in building relationships with the reasonable residents of Whispering Pines earlier, creating allies before the conflict escalated. But overall, I think I handled the situation as well as could be expected. The sun had fully set now, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. I walked back to my house, comfortable and satisfied with the life I had built and defended. Tomorrow I had a cargo run to Winnipeg, then flying lessons with 2 students in the afternoon. Life was good, and I had earned that goodness through knowledge, courage, and unwillingness to accept injustice. The story of Xavier Crawford versus the Whispering Pines HOA would continue to be told for years in the local aviation community, sometimes exaggerated in the retelling, always serving as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and an inspirational story about standing up for your rights. And that was fine with me. If my experience helped even one person resist unjust treatment or think twice before abusing HOA authority, then all the stress and conflict had been worth it. I settled into my chair, put my feet up, and opened a book I had been meaning to read. Outside, the lake lapped gently at the shore, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted its evening call. Everything was exactly as it should be, peaceful and secure, mine by right and protected by law. Patricia Hendricks had tried to take that away, and she had failed. The seaplanes would continue to fly. The water would continue to welcome their landings, and I would continue to live the life I had chosen, free and unfettered, master of my own property and destiny.